So what do you know about the website itch.io? Chances are you've probably heard of it from a few sources, maybe either a game jam or some sort of game development expo. At least, that's how I've personally discovered it. Itch is a super friendly platform for indie devs, since uploading games on there is relatively easy. You'll usually find free, smaller titles listed, but on rare occasions you might find some paid games as well. But for indie devs, that's a double-edged sword. Itch.io may be more accessible, but the player base is much more extensive on platforms like Steam. Steam has all the players you need, but setting up even a single game page is tons of work. There's business details needed, company questions, banners, $100 fee, spec requirements, compatibility details, all that stuff. And that's not even counting the hundreds of other games fighting for your attention. Simply put, it's a lot of work, and it's easy to take for granted all the effort that goes over on the business side of development. Now, why do I mention all of this? Well, I was asked by Team 7th Star to look at their first commercial game, Code Bunny. The game's not new per se, as it's been out ever since September 2023, but it's only been available on itch.io. So now, with a new update in the works, they're also working on getting a Steam page for the game as well, hopefully to reach a bigger audience and such. And by the time I finish this video, the game's already out on Steam, probably with some new updates as well. So if your curiosity is ever piqued, feel free to give the game a shot. But yeah, I don't mind giving this a light of day. I'm all for supporting indies out there, and I'm glad I can also give my own opinions. I'm not paid to give a good rating or anything. The only difference is that I get an early copy of the game for free, but I'll still take the game's price into consideration. So I can freely say that the game is either the second coming of Christ, or that the game is worse than Concord. Free speech. And hey, if I'm allowed to say what I want, that shows some confidence coming from the dev team, so I'm looking forward to what the game has to offer. Since the game's gonna be new for a lot of people, I'm placing a spoiler warning here for the majority of the game. I won't get into story details until much later, but gameplay and everything else will be covered completely. So if you're looking to get the game yourself, I recommend you do just that and stop watching until later. It's cheap, short and sweet, and you're not losing much by playing it. Anyways, let's finally dive into Code Bunny. So our story takes place on a planet named Lumina. For years, the people of Lumina have sought out Ether, the most powerful and versatile energy source ever discovered. Ether eventually became extractable from its source, Comet Iliaster. So a major tech company named Lagos Hyperbolics would work together with Lumina's government, forming a project for the sole purpose of harnessing the comet's energy. The project in question being the VY Space Program. And this is where we follow our two protagonists. Hazel, a stern, experienced soldier joining as a new recruit to the program, and Axel, a famous ice skater who's been in the program for a few years. Their first mission on the job is to find a threat located in Lumina City, which has left the place in destruction, and this is where the game initially begins. So Code Bunny is a 2D action platformer, focused on quick movement and a bit of combat. There's a combo counter, enemies to fight through, and a handful of levels and bosses. Depending on your character of choice, your abilities and overall gameplay will vary drastically. Hazel is someone more combat focused, capable of a 4-hit combo, attacks on the move, a down slash to bounce off enemies, and a quick parry. Your main ability is the Ghost Crescent. Shooting an arrow can mark enemies or specific objects, and with the press of a button, you'll dash directly towards those targets, dealing damage, granting some speed, and a double jump as well. The ability also allows you to move through walls and makes you invincible for a short moment. I feel like I've seen that somewhere before. So the Ghost Crescent is your bread and butter. It's essential not only for quick movement, but for combat and bosses as well. Hazel also sports a karma meter, which is expended for more damage with Ghost Crescent. However, the more karma you have, the more damage you'll take as well. If you have too much karma to the point where it exceeds your health, you'll enter a powered up state, but one hit will immediately put you in critical health. It's a risk-reward system, where the benefits are solely focused on combat, but not much for movement. This makes Hazel's abilities work best in boss fights, but she manages just fine in the stages. Axel is almost the complete opposite of Hazel. He's more movement-based, with only one real combat move which isn't exactly useful. Axel primarily uses his spin attack, which provides quick movement and can bounce off enemies to deal damage. And just like Hazel, this is what you'll be using liberally. Not only does it help build speed, but it also grants invincibility for a moment, can be used to reach new areas, and is practically your best combat move. You've also got a stomp to bounce off enemies and other abilities tied to your EX meter. Bouncing off enemies fills up the EX meter, and once it's full, you can perform actions that grant more offensive capabilities. There's a passive one-use shield, a dive kick that does big damage, a short dash that also does big damage, and the comet boost that gives a small air boost with a surrounding blast to hit enemies. The EX meter is actually drained when using your basic 3-hit combo, so simple attacks are actively discouraged, which means all combat encounters should be approached with a spin attack and your EX moves. We'll get into the combat later though. As for the levels themselves, they play fairly well with both characters. Stages are designed in a sort of linear but slightly open manner. The objective is always the same, get to the goal. But stages are open in that failing certain jumps won't kill you, but drop you in a cluttered, slower path. Higher paths are faster and rewarding, while lower ones are slower and more punishing. I feel like I've also heard that somewhere before. Now, the levels aren't super open or anything. There's basically just one high path and one low path. But regardless, I find it an interesting way to tackle the level design, and I think it works in the game's favor. Its rewards find play, but falling down a pit is almost never a death sentence, and the game still pushes you forward. The only punishment is that they're slower and you have some more enemies to face, which is a fair consequence. All the levels are fairly short in length, being about 2 minutes or less on your first time through. But oddly enough, they never felt that short to get through. You do a lot to keep your speed going, and the levels begin to test your abilities once you're able to stay up top. You're never encouraged to fight the enemies, but rather use them as a means to move faster. If there's a bunch in your way, chances are you're in a slower route, and their abundance is the consequence of that. Enemy placement also means a lot for level design. Level layout is important, but enemies play an important role for characters who interact with them frequently. As a result, enemies are placed differently for Axel and Hazel, as their abilities call for different needs to progress. You'd think that the overall level design suffers to accommodate for both playstyles, but I think it does just fine in striking a good balance between the two. There's this little bit in the first stage that I really like, which serves as a good example. With Hazel, the first two enemies are easy to fight so you can adjust to your abilities, but this enemy is at the end of a large gap you can't cross. Your only option is to mark them. So when you mark them and attack, it tells you that marked enemies can be used to cross large distances you otherwise can't. With Axel, it's a bit more different. The first enemies serve the same purpose, but this enemy is placed right in front of you so you spin into it. And as you do that, an enemy spawns right behind you, so you bounce off the first enemy, bump right into the second guy, and then back into the first, killing off both at once. It shows that bouncing off two enemies at once is an efficient way of dealing with them. It's a nice way of conveying your strengths through enemy placement rather than just outright telling you. I mean, the tutorial does that too, but my point still stands. Enemy placement means a lot, and all the stages do a good job with it. I do have one small nitpick with these guys though. These flying bots are invincible, and they're not actual enemies. They're more like dummies to attack so you can move forward. But having them appear as just another bot conveys the idea that these are enemies to fight, just like the rest of the bots. I even tried killing them when I first saw them, but realized I couldn't. I think having these enemies replaced with a level object would have been better, since you might try to kill them on your first sighting. Other than that, enemies are completely fine, and none of them caused any big issues. I'm glad that the stages are slightly altered to cater to both characters, but the two also get their own unique stage, and they're probably the best in the game because of that. In both campaigns, the fourth level is unique to each character, Underpass for Axel and Lagos Hyperbolics HQ for Hazel. Underpass is focused on speed with these grind rails, while Lagos HQ is an open space filled with enemies to chain off of. Both levels play into each character's strengths, and I honestly would have liked to see more of it, but I understand how difficult that'd be to develop, and both campaigns do have to follow similar storylines anyways. I just think having more levels like this would be a neat idea. Now, I've been praising the levels and characters so far, but I do have a few issues. Firstly, the stages. In Yokkaido and Iliaster Core, it's kind of hard to discern the level design from the level detail. The background can kind of blend in with the actual level geometry, so it can be hard to tell what is and isn't a wall. And in a game where you can move pretty fast, it can be even harder to react properly. In Iliaster Core, everything's a different shade of gray, including background details. Thankfully, it's not too hard to see the level, but there were moments where platforms started to blend in with the background. There's these three enemies in Axel's Forest of Morag that you can't bounce off reliably. It's a small spacing issue that makes it a 50-50 shot of bouncing up properly. A patch did come by with enemy position adjustments, but you can still fall out of it sometimes. Either I'm terrible at doing this, or it's a small oversight. I'd like to think both. Iliaster Core also has a gimmick focused on falling through the bottom of the level to warp up to the top, which is a pretty cool idea that the level utilizes well. However, since the camera can't cover both the top and bottom of the level, it's possible to be blindsided by an enemy when you warp in from the bottom. Not exactly a big problem since health isn't much of a concern, but when going for a no damage run, it can be pretty annoying. Wonderland also has a problem with its teleporting hat gimmick. The concept is clear enough, enter the blue hat and teleport to the orange hat. But when teleporting, you're not really sent out with a big push or anything, so if you entered with some low speed and the orange hat tries to launch you somewhere, you'll most likely fall off with no speed. And just like Iliaster Core, if the orange hat is off camera, it'll immediately jump to wherever you're sent, which leaves very little time to react and make the right movements. But since the hats send you through based on speed, you could end up launching yourself super far if you enter with a big jump. I only did it by accident to be fair, but there's definitely some speedrun potential there. Speaking of speedruns, levels are inherently designed for that kind of play. I've mentioned that all levels are pretty short, but all the different routes encourage repeat playthroughs to find shortcuts through each character's abilities. Axel certainly benefits more from speedruns than Hazel does, seeing as his playstyle focuses on movement. and in my opinion, Underpass is probably the best stage of the game simply because of its speedrunning potential. Once you've found the best path forward, it's a rewarding challenge to perfect your run. The only suggestion I have is an option for an on-screen timer. There's a timer for speedrun mode, but that's a full marathon of the game, so if you're looking to speedrun individual levels, there's unfortunately no timer to see. It's not really a big issue since the stages are already short enough, but the feature would have been nice. Also, having an option to retry level after beating it would be appreciated. Aside from speedruns, there's also different criteria with a ranking system as well, the lowest being a C rank and the best being an S+ burst. The ranking system is a safe way of encouraging replays outside of speedrunning while still offering its own challenge. It's also a good indication of whether I was doing good on a stage or outright fumbled my way to the end. However, I had a few issues with it. I went ahead and got S ranks for every stage and boss fight, and I found the combo requirements to be a bit high. They usually ask for something like 60 or 70, which is already pretty big for such short stages. Axel gets some lower combo counts, but the issue still remains. I usually struck the same enemy for an easy combo in combination with a good time, especially since 2 stages ask for a combo as high as 160. Also, boss fights have their own ranks as well, but they don't show on the mission select screen. I know I've S ranked all the bosses as both characters, but unfortunately it's not displayed here. Also, Hazel has a boss fight after some flashbacks with its own ranking, but that boss isn't selectable in the level select, and using classic mode completely skips over the boss fight, since it's counted as a story scene. So if you missed that S rank like I did, not only would you probably forget about it, but you'll also have to go through an entire flashback sequence just to try again. Thankfully, the S rank is pretty easy, but having an option to fight the boss only is clearly needed. Past the ranking system, each level is pretty fun to play through, with some having unique gimmicks as well. Luminous City is a good opening level, Yokkaido's Wind can be fun to mess with, and the screen warping for Iliastra's Core was an interesting challenge. There's a part of me that wishes for more unique levels built around each protagonist, but I also really enjoy having shared levels between the two. Speedruns and ranks are nice for replayability, and the short level length becomes less of an issue as a result, but if you're not interested in that aspect of the game, I still think all the levels do a decent job in design and structure. A few fixes to the teleporting and visual details would just be a nice cherry on top of it all. As for the characters, I think they're mostly good. They control well, their primary abilities are distinct and useful, and both have an enjoyable flow to their gameplay styles. They don't really have any major flaws, but I still have some gripes. First of all, Axel's Stomp can only be used once in the air, and either needs to land on the ground or spin attack an enemy to reset it. Why can't I just have unlimited stomps, or at the very least like 2? Hazel's completely fine bouncing off enemies repeatedly, so what's with the limited use? I was also really desperate for abilities that give you more vertical movement. Axel has the Comet Boost, which kinda helps, but that's all you're getting for the whole game. Hazel doesn't have anything at all, so you're completely reliant on enemies to reach higher areas. It kinda makes vertical sections awkward and slow, but they're pretty brief so it's nothing terrible. Axel does get a super jump after finishing speedrun mode, so that alleviates the issue somewhat, but Hazel still doesn't get anything like that. It's not a big problem, but it still came up as a sticking point when platforms were just barely out of reach. As for both characters, their unique metas provide some powerful abilities, but I wasn't really encouraged to use them and found them a bit situational. Axel's shield was useful for minor slip-ups, and Hazel's parry and karma mode were rewarding moves for fine play, but anything else was really in the back of my mind while playing. Axel's Comet Boost was useful for the extra height, but I only used it a handful of times. I think I only used his dive kick once, and the Comet Dash would be useful if I wasn't already avoiding enemies in my way. Hazel's extra damage from draining karma was basically a passive buff, and I'm still not entirely sure what this white meter does. I understand the potential behind the special moves, but their appeal only came through in speedruns. Axel's moves became crucial for accessing high routes, and Hazel's buffs are extremely effective when it comes to rushing boss fights. But outside of that, I never really felt a strong incentive to experiment and try out their special abilities. The Ghost Crescent and Spin Attack were already pretty powerful moves to begin with, and they also provided some invincibility at the cost of nothing. Even when going for S ranks, I didn't really use any special moves because the primary abilities already provided the power and speed I needed. Maybe they'd be more useful for S+ ranks, but I can't say for sure. Overall, the characters are designed mostly well. I really appreciate their distinct playstyles and their different approaches to each level, but there's a few setbacks that were present throughout my first and second playthroughs, and the incentive behind their special moves are fairly lacking. Maybe if the special moves had more significance or better use cases, then I'd see myself using them more. But in a regular playthrough, I never felt like using them. Your primary abilities already do the job just fine, and I was much more comfortable using them with their powerful traits. Still, I did enjoy playing both characters despite that. Okay, let's finally get into the combat and bosses. Generally speaking, combat is very simple, given that both characters only have a handful of attacks and enemies aren't exactly a major obstacle. Again, enemies are more of a means to reach different areas or an obstacle to slow you down in lower routes. You can kill every enemy you see, but that's not exactly the game's focus unless you're going for big combos. Both characters have a basic combo to work with, but their primary moves are your main damage dealers. Your special moves can add some extra damage, but they're not needed all too much. So combat in levels is more of a tool to fly through the stages. But boss fights are where the combat takes center stage, and unfortunately, it's sort of a mixed bag. Let's go over the good first. Each boss has their own attack patterns, visual cues, and maybe a unique gimmick mixed in. With enough practice and proper reactions, every boss can be finished without taking a single hit, so none of them are outright unfair or cheap. Some of the later bosses can throw a lot your way, but it's all telegraphed properly with certain actions or patterns. They're all well designed and honestly lack any major flaws. The only downside, the big problem with these boss fights aren't the bosses themselves, but it's your primary abilities. The spin attack and ghost crescent are simply too overpowered. It's so easy to just spam the same attack and finish most of the bosses because any attack can just be shrugged off by your iframes. As Axel, you can just spam spin attack. As Hazel, repeated ghost crescents give similar results. Things only get more challenging when the boss can fly around and out of reach, but that only applies to about 2 of the 6 bosses. Even then, Hazel can work around it with proper execution and planning, but Axel's only option is to just wait for a chance to attack. It's not mindless, but it's not exactly challenging either. I think Hazel actually finds a good balance for the 2 bosses that fly around. They can be pushovers, but only if you know the boss patterns well and have proper execution to avoid missing your marks. But the rest of the bosses are far too easy and one-sided. Hazel clearly gets the better experience, thanks to a rewarding parry move and just better combat abilities in general. Axel is either an unstoppable mindless Beyblade, or repeatedly jumping at the boss until they die. His EX moves can deal some extra damage, but most of the fight is still the same. At the very least, I did enjoy the bosses for their quick pace. If you know what to do, they're done in less than a minute and you're on to the next level. They're extremely straightforward, but a few require some attention to get them done as soon as possible. Still though, I'd like to have some bosses that pose more of a threat or a challenge. I died more to the bottomless pits than the actual bosses themselves. They're very flawed in that a single move destroys more than half the fights, but their short length and simple strategies do well in keeping the game moving. I still think the bosses could use a design overhaul. It's not that they're bad, it's just that you're too overpowered. If you controlled a character like Mega Man X or Zero, these bosses would probably fit right in. Hazel fares a bit better in balancing, but it's not much harder than Axel's strategy. If all bosses were less vulnerable and we were less powerful, then there'd probably be a better challenge here. In fact, I feel like that's the biggest problem I have with the game. Your main ability for both characters is just too powerful. It grants a good amount of speed and power, it makes you invincible for a second, and it's easily spammable to make combat nearly a non-issue. That makes sense given it's your main ability, but it also overshadows the other elements of the game. The extra abilities are no longer enticing, the bosses are too unbalanced, and what's left is the ranking system and speedruns to try if you're even into those things. As a result, the game can be a bit too easy. That might be a good thing to some, you know, it's accessible and all, but as someone who's played a lot of these types of games already, these are some things that hold the game back for me. If things were more balanced between the bosses, your extra abilities, and your main abilities, I think the game would benefit much more from that. Or maybe provide a hard mode where all those things are adjusted for a more challenging experience. The gameplay, as it is now, is a mostly fun experience, but also has some flaws, both big and small. I enjoyed the 2 playable characters, the levels and their different routes, the speedrun and ranking system, and even the quick pace of the boss fights, but there's plenty of things to improve upon. Level gimmicks could use some polish, the special moves need improvements, and bosses should probably be designed differently to counter your invincible attacks. I think the gameplay really caters towards speedrunners the most. Levels are designed around quick play, your abilities are much more useful, and some of the simpler factors could be optimized more than other players would realize. The underpass stage for Axel is probably my favorite simply because of its speedrun factor. If you're into that stuff, then you'll probably get a lot out of the gameplay. But if you're not, the lower difficulty and shorter length may be good or bad depending on if you're looking for that sort of thing. And even then, you can find some challenge and replay value in getting better ranks in all the levels. Altogether, I did enjoy most of the gameplay. It's an interesting mix between some genres that I haven't really seen before, and I think the execution is done pretty well. The gameplay on all the levels can be kinda short, but I don't think that's entirely a bad thing given the game's replayability aspect. There's definitely some issues I can't overlook, and will definitely need some work in the future, but there's more here that I enjoy over things that I dislike. Okay, now that was a lot to talk about just for the gameplay side of things, so let's quickly go over the other stuff. Visually, I mean, you've already seen a lot of the game at this point, and it's pretty straightforward. There's a clear focus on a simple retro style, but with a few effects and assets that aren't completely pixelated. 3D models, slight use of bloom, smooth trailing effects. They're small touches, but certainly noticeable and follow the game's more sci-fi setting. I think it gives the game a nice advanced look that slightly exceeds the 8-bit aesthetics. It can seem a bit cheap or generic when the pixelated assets clash with more modern graphics, like the menu text for example, but I think the sci-fi aesthetic helps to make it seem more natural. Level themes are interesting enough to avoid being too generic, but I can't say that many stuck out to me outside of a few exceptions. Character sprites are small to compensate for gameplay, but are still detailed enough for readable poses and actions. The brief slowdown for the parry and ghost crescent adds some nice feedback and extra emphasis to their strength, and the handful of 3D effects are always nice to see in a mostly 2D game. I honestly can't think of any major problems I have with the game in this aspect. I mean, this part in Forest of Morag has a foreground layer that just disappears, and I already mentioned how level details could blend in with the level geometry, so I won't repeat myself here. But aside from those, the game looks pretty good everywhere else. It's nothing mind-blowing or anything, but it's not terrible either. And I could say the same for the music. It's a soundtrack completely made in FamiTracker, so it's still following that retro aesthetic. And initially, I was expecting to get a little tired or fatigued by the game's soundtrack. I don't hate the 8-bit sound font or anything, but I feel it can be somewhat limiting and as a result, either repetitive or even ear-grating to listen to after a long time. Obviously, there are many games that prove otherwise, but I was worried that the tracks would blend together or get on my nerves in some way. And personally speaking, I don't mind if a retro-styled game has a soundtrack that doesn't follow the 8-bit sound fonts. Even with those concerns, I think Code Bunny did pretty good with its music. Now, there are a few tracks I kinda found uninteresting or even generic, but most of them were distinct and fitting for each scene they're used in. You've got tense tracks for important cutscenes, catchy tunes for most of the levels, and more relaxed pieces for calmer moments. My favorite tracks are definitely the ones for the unique stages. It comes during a turning point in the story for both protagonists, so both stages have a kick in energy for their tracks. It's funny that the best parts of this game to me always surround the stages exclusive to each character. Maybe they really should get their own set of levels. Anyways, the OST is catchy stuff. I initially thought this game kinda lacked any themes or motifs, but after a closer listen, some tracks were slightly altered or remixed versions of other tracks, rather than having any shared motifs. I might be wrong there, so take that with a grain of salt. I was also kind of expecting character themes for both protagonists, but they didn't have any, which I feel was kind of a missed opportunity. But most of the music is still pretty good, so it's not a big concern to me. Just like the visuals, I didn't have many problems with the game's OST, just a few weaker tracks and that's about it. Personally, I wouldn't mind if they went past the 8-bit sound font just to spice things up a bit, but what we have here works just fine. Also, just a small tidbit, but in the official soundtrack in Bandcamp, they're missing both the credits theme and the short theme of a character's appearance during a flashback sequence. Not sure if that was intentional, but I wanted to mention it just in case it wasn't. Now time for the story, so if you want to avoid story spoilers, now is the time to leave or skip over this part. But as a quick non-spoiler summary, I was kinda surprised by how far the story went, and it might have went slightly too far given the game's scale. I feel like it kinda ended too quickly with some vague details, but I think the story worked pretty well, especially given that there's almost 2 different stories at play here. Anyways, get out now to avoid spoilers, and if you don't care, let's move on. So the game's plot plays slightly differently depending on who you're playing as. Most of the plot points and ending are generally the same for Axel and Hazel, but lots of things in between are vastly different. So for the sake of simplicity and to avoid confusing my smooth brain, I'll go over one character's story and then quickly go over the other characters after. And I'll kinda skim over some details to make things quick, since there's a lot of plot to go over for both protagonists. So let's start with Axel's story, since I picked him first. As a quick refresher, Lumina is the name of the game's world, Ether is the most powerful energy source, and Ether can be extracted from Comet Iliaster. The government of Lumina teamed up with a major tech company named Lagos Hyperbolics to create the VY space program. The project's sole purpose was to harness Ether from Comet Iliaster, with a team consisting of Igusa, Raffi, Axel, and the newest member, Hazel. Raffi's the engineer, Igusa's the guy in the chair, Hazel's the soldier and your recruit, and Axel, if you're playing as him, is the person on the field who dislikes fighting. The team first inspects some destruction down at Lumina City, leading to an encounter with someone named Loon, who's capable of opening portals. Afterwards, a group called Mad Bunny show themselves, seemingly responsible for all the destruction. With their reveal, the space program is tasked with finding Mad Bunny and preventing whatever plans they have. Axel finds 2 of the members, Faye Nix and Shoko Hikari. They both convey that their goals are complicated, and that Axel shouldn't trust Lagos Hyperbolics. Axel attempts to avoid any fighting, but is forced to defeat both of them regardless. He also discovers that they're seeking out Comet shards to help Loon out in some way. Nonetheless, Axel begins having doubts on his mission and his own motivations, with Hazel having a chat with him back at HQ. Axel describes a bit of his past, growing up with his younger brother Lucien in a rough neighborhood. I don't know if it's pronounced Lucien or Lucian, but I'm going with Lucien. He doesn't like conflict, but he learned to fight for self-defense. As he grew up and became a famous ice skater, Lucien grew ill and Axel took a job at Lagos Hyperbolics to cover his medical bills. Unfortunately, Lucien passed away and Axel stays in the space program unsure of what to do next. Hazel informs him that he shouldn't fight for what he doesn't believe in and should fight for things he cherishes, like Raffi and Nagusa, who he spent years with in the space program. Soon after, Raffi finds the location of Loon, so Axel immediately gives chase through the underpass. Once caught up, Axel continues to fight Loon for some answers, with him absorbing Loon's corruption to reveal that he's actually Lucian. Raffi immediately comes in to take Loon elsewhere, as both Raffi and Nagusa seem to have their own plans. Axel continues to give chase, and we're given a coincidental flashback of him and Raffi talking together. Raffi mentions the Stardust Clock Tower located in Wonderland, which holds the most ether in the country, so Axel makes his way there, with Raffi at the top of the tower. After another fight, she explains that Nagusa, Loon, and the CEO of Lagos Hyperbolics, Soleil, are planning on using the ether so Loon can open a portal straight to the Elaster Comet's core. Axel, too late to stop them, laments over the past years he's worked with Raffi and Nagusa, seeing them all as lies. Raffi argues against that, but Comet Elaster goes berserk and warps everyone to an unknown space. This is where Axel witnesses Lucian's transformation into Loon, where Soleil had used his illness and corruption for her own plans and experiments, whilst giving Loon some amnesia. Seeking to save Lucian, Axel finds Raffi standing in his way, with her refusing to move and committing to a final battle. But this time, Axel refuses to fight back, and this also ties into the gameplay in a pretty neat way. Raffi is a normal boss fight, but killing her has Axel regretting his decision and resets everything. You're actually meant to pause the game and choose to exit the level, which has Axel completely give up on fighting Raffi. It's kinda out of nowhere, but still a nice little twist for the game side of things. Anyways, Axel refuses to fight Raffi, accepting that Lucian is already gone. Raffi also gives up and tells Axel what's going on behind the scenes. Okay, here we go. Soleil was in love with Raffi's father, named Dr. Meliez. Meliez would end up dying due to a strong illness, which had Soleil attempt to bring him back through any means necessary. Raffi would also assist Soleil without question, as she promised Raffi could see her father again, but with the fight against Axel, Raffi realizes that dream is long gone, so she implores Axel to save Soleil from her grief and suffering, with Axel planning on saving Loon as well. On his way there, Axel runs into Agusa, who further elaborates on Soleil's plans. Through Agusa's mother, Dr. Ren Yatsuki, Soleil discovered that everyone is made of a little bit of ether with their own unique signatures, their code in a sense, and when someone passes away, their ether and the code within them is sent back to Iliaster's core. So by extracting ether from the comet, Soleil would attempt to bring back Meliez using his ether signature. Agusa was going along with the plan because Soleil also promised that she could see her mother again, just like she manipulated Raffi. However, with her plan in disaster, Soleil seeks to destroy Iliaster's core, which spells bad news for everyone. So Axel finally confronts Soleil, who states that nothing matters and that everything is nothing more than a dream. After some confusion and one last battle, Soleil and Axel find Loon while elaborating on the dream part of the world. Turns out, the nature of the world is partially made up like a simulation, and Soleil sees everything as pointless because of it. But Axel and Loon state that everything they've experienced in the past, their pain and joy, all still felt real, and will continue living their lives despite the foundation of the world's nature. And with that ends Code Bunny for Axel's campaign. Okay, now Hazel's story is very different from Axel's, but let's stop and talk about Axel's part first. So the storyline for Axel is generally pretty good. Some characters have a lot of significance in Axel's story, and I think the writing for everyone is solid stuff. Maybe a few typos and inconsistencies, but that's not too bad. My biggest issue is that they throw in a bit too much story near the end, and the pace sort of falls off because of it. At the start, they balance the story and gameplay just fine, but by the 4th stage, things start getting more complicated, and then there's a lot more plot to read through. I was intrigued, sure, but cutscenes got really long, probably longer than the actual stages. You'll spend minutes reading through a bunch of dialogue, and I feel like there wasn't enough game left to flesh out the last bits of the story, so it's all sort of crammed in between the last few levels as a result. Also, it's just a bunch of exposition thrown your way. They have Soleil's sudden introduction, Dr. Meliez, who's Raffi's father, Dr. Ren Yatsuki, who's Agusa's mother, then Soleil's relationship between the two, the code within ether, and then the truth behind the world's true nature being a simulation, which is a super last minute plot point. It's a lot to process in such a short time, and I feel like it was pushing slightly too far for the game's short length. And this is something I'll address later, but there's a few characters who don't really do much. Hazel's basically needed for one cutscene, Agusa doesn't do much aside from more story exposition near the end, and the two Mad Bunny members don't exactly do much after they're dealt with. And Soleil, the main villain behind the scenes, is suddenly name-dropped after the 5th stage. You only find out who she is a few scenes after, which is a weird way to structure her introduction. The rest of Axel's story isn't bad though. Axel's struggle with fighting, the loss of his brother, and his overall beliefs are put together really well. The important characters in his story have good writing behind them, and there wasn't anything I disliked or got put off by. But I feel like the game's short length held back the story a lot. I liked the more complex story, and I found it interesting enough to stay engaged, but that last part was kinda stretching it. I think if we had more game time to flesh out those last plot points, the execution would have been better off. But let's move on to Hazel's plotline, and to keep things brief, I'll go over this part a bit faster. Because again, some plot points are shared between Axel and Hazel, but a lot of things are also different. So Hazel's the new recruit in the VY space program. As an experienced soldier from the Xanadu army, she's assigned to help out on the field, and her first mission is finding Loon in Lumina City. She fights Loon, Mad Bunny appears, they retreat, and Hazel heads back to HQ. Since Hazel is your playable character, Axel is set aside for most of the game, but he's relieved that he isn't the one fighting, so that's a nice touch. Hazel tracks down Faye and Shoko just like Axel does. Faye is taken in for questioning, and Shoko remarks about getting revenge for what Hazel and Soleil did, with Hazel being confused on that last part. After her retreat and back at HQ, Hazel explains her past to Axel. She was friends with Shoko and someone named Ash. Ash joined the army with the dream of helping people, with Hazel wanting to be just like him and joining as well. Unfortunately, Ash was killed, and Hazel is a lot less lively because of it. Moving on, Hazel lingers on what Shoko said after their fight, and suspects something wrong with Lagos and their CEO. So after some info from Agusa, Hazel investigates a private module within Lagos HQ. Through a journal entry by Soleil, she explains her plans on bringing Loon to Wonderland. But to get the funding for the project, they decided to make clones of the most deadly warrior in the Xanadu army, being Hazel. Okay? After fighting all the clones and definitely not dying, Hazel wakes up in Mad Bunny's hideout. Faye was escaping from the HQ and found Hazel knocked out, so she brought her to their hideout. Despite their past relations, Shoko informs Hazel of what's truly going on behind the scenes. Shoko investigated what was going on at the Lagos facilities, where she rescued Faye and Loon. Turns out, Lagos is experimenting on hundreds of people, with Loon having it the worst. His corruption slowly kills him, and Mad Bunny used comet shards as a way to heal his corruptions, but with his previous suit destroyed and some shards broken due to Hazel, they had to speed up plans. Soleil took Loon away from Mad Bunny, and Hazel claims he was taken to Wonderland based on Soleil's journal entry. So Shoko decides to head there, with Hazel choosing to go as well to make things right. Hazel and Shoko find Raffi at the clock tower, explains the plan on using Loon's portals, and the comet still goes crazy afterwards. Hazel sent through flashbacks of Ash's memories, and we get some more backstory. Ash planned on leaving the army, seeing as it wasn't like he dreamed of. Hazel also had similar opinions, but enjoyed being with Ash and lied about wanting to stay. After his decision, Ash gets a message from Soleil, stating that Ash is immediately promoted and in charge of the current operation, which is now classified. Seeing the situation probably worsen, Ash decides to put an end to it all and go rogue. Hazel, being confused and overwhelmed, kills Ash with his own sword. And back to the present, Shoko also witnesses the flashback and is now dead set on killing Hazel. Hazel still wins, doesn't kill Shoko, and says that she never wanted to kill anyone. She was lost after losing Ash, but slowly found her resolve after getting into the VY space program. Shoko doesn't forgive her yet, but trusts her and tells her to stop Soleil and find Loon. Getting through Ilyaster's core, Hazel finds Agusa, stating that she knew about Soleil's shady plans, but didn't have the power or courage to fight back. So Agusa used Hazel as a means to get things done, apologizing for the lies. She also states that Soleil is destroying Ilyaster's core, so Hazel goes to confront her. At this point, the story is about the same as Axel's. Soleil sees that reality is a lie, you beat her up, she explains that everything's a simulation, and Loon and Hazel still want to live to achieve their dreams because everything they experience is still real. So yeah, a bunch of stuff is pretty different from Axel's story, but there's still some shared traits between the two, both in the plot points and my opinions with the overall story. Now, some of the issues I had with Axel's plot are basically shared with Hazel's. Some characters don't really do much, there's a bunch of exposition near the end, and the pacing suffers because of it, even more so with Hazel's longer flashback sequence. But just like Axel's story, the characters are written well, the story is still compelling, and Hazel's backstory and motivations are intriguing, if a bit melodramatic. I feel like the ending with Loon is a bit less impactful since he doesn't really matter much in Hazel's campaign, but everything else is generally the same. A small criticism I do have is the talk room and its significance. The talk room is where you see some optional banter between the VY space team, and I really enjoy features like this. It adds some extra personality to the characters and fun interactions that you usually don't see in the main story cutscenes. They even have some extra dialogue depending on who you're currently playing as, which is a nice touch. But it's sort of needed to believe the connections between Hazel and the other members. Playing as Hazel and seeing her form a good bond with the team somewhat depends on if you look through the talk room dialogue. So if you ignored it, the resolve Hazel finds with the team is slightly harder to believe. It's not a major issue by any means, but it's one that I noticed. For the game's story as a whole, it kinda surprised me, but also overwhelmed me a bit. I was expecting a plot with a simple second layer to it, but it went further with the character backstories, and then gave two different plot lines on top of that. That might be a bad thing if you're expecting a more simplistic story, but I'm open to having games like these with deeper narratives. I'm no story writing expert, but I found the game's plot fairly entertaining. The writing's good, nothing's terribly unfitting, and within the gameplay context, the story still fits for both protagonists, which I find pretty impressive. I think it's interesting how they focus on different characters depending on who you play as. It adds unique value to both stories, but at the same time, it diminishes the presence of other characters as a result. I don't know if it's a good or bad thing, but I think it's a reasonable compromise for two separate storylines. Honestly, I would have liked more interactions between both protagonists, since I just think those are cool, but I guess that's what the talk room's for. Unfortunately, the game's shorter length kinda hurts the story in the long run. With how much dialogue and exposition are given throughout the game, it feels like the overall playtime is like half game and half story. I'm not entirely sure that's a good thing, especially when levels and bosses can be beaten in such a short time. It's slightly too ambitious given the gameplay's scale, but I can still admire the dedication and effort placed into the story for both characters. There's definitely some weaker points in the game's narrative, but I was entertained by it regardless, and given that there's practically 2 different storylines here, I'm amazed by how well it all played out. So at the price of $10, I'd say that Code Bunny is kinda worth it. If you're someone who loves speedrunning, specifically for quick action platformers, I'd say you'll be getting the most out of the game, but even casual players who enjoy this kind of stuff can get some enjoyment as well. It's a short and sweet game with an interesting concept and captivating story behind it. The gameplay might look a bit shallow on the surface, but there's a lot of replayability with the ranks and speedrun potential. The graphical style and music are generally pretty good, and the story was much better than I expected, but it still had some flaws here and there. The game's got some rough edges that clearly need some ironing out, and I hope that they can be improved upon in the future. Despite that, my overall experience wasn't ruined, and I still had a lot of fun playing through everything. If you're on the fence, I'd say it wouldn't hurt giving the game a shot. The extremely low price certainly helps with that. If you've played similar titles, the game might not be anything too new, but it'll be an enjoyable experience with some interesting ideas. As of right now, the game's only out on PC via Steam and itch.io, but everyone's got a PC, so that shouldn't be a big concern. It's also playable on Steam Deck, which shouldn't have any problems running, but I haven't tried it myself yet, and there seems to be some plans for more content in the future, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. Lastly, I just want to say big thanks to Team 7th Star for reaching out to me and providing a copy of the game. It seems like development was a real roller coaster given the ambitious scale, but I'm glad it's finally out on Steam for more people to discover. I'm honestly surprised anyone offered me to look at their game so soon, but I'm really grateful I got the opportunity at all, so
Thanks for thanking of me.
Anyways, that's about everything I wanted to cover, and wow, that certainly took a minute. I wasn't planning on making another lengthy video, and I even trimmed down the script, but here we are regardless. I guess I can't help but to be comprehensive sometimes, which may or may not be a good thing, but I'm still glad I took a look at this game and gave my honest opinions, because I really did enjoy my time with Code Bunny, but also wanted to improve on its flaws. Anyhow, if you want to see more, here's a few videos, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff, and I'll see you all in another video, hopefully one that's not super long.